Thank you for being here. My name is Brian Winter. I'm the Vice President of Policy for America's Society, Council of the Americas, and the Editor-in-Chief for America's Quarterly. Joe Biden said during his presidential campaign that there would be a renewed emphasis on multilateral organizations during his presidency. And sure enough, on his first day in office, he announced that the United States was rejoining the Paris Climate Accords, and he was also stopping the process of the U.S. withdrawal from the World Health Organization. The question that we're going to try to address here today on this panel is, what does this renewed emphasis on multilateralism mean for Latin America and for hemispheric relations? What does it mean for organizations like the World Bank, the OAS, the IDB, the United Nations, the IMF, and so on? And it's not actually a straightforward question, because on one side you have the intentions of this new U.S. administration, but it's also true that not everybody in the Americas right now is a fan necessarily of a greater role for these multilateral organizations. I think specifically of governments in Brazil and in Mexico that at least at some level we're actually quite happy with the greater emphasis on nationalism and sort of the go-it-alone approach that prevailed during the Trump years. It also raises the question of what this greater role means, given the fact that Latin America has been the region in many ways, economically, also in terms of just human lives, it's been the region hardest hit by the COVID-19 pandemic. To help us sort these questions out, or at least begin to do so, we've got a great panel with us today. Joaquim Levy is the former managing director and CFO of the World Bank Group. Maria Otero is the former Undersecretary of State for Civilian Security, Democracy, and Human Rights for the U.S. government. And Arturo Sarukhan is the former ambassador of Mexico to the United States. We've got a lot of ground to cover today. I've asked our panelists to keep their answers relatively short. This is a public event. We'll be recording it and posting it online, I think, later today. So we will also accept questions after this initial exchange of ideas through the chat function on WebEx. So again, thank you to everybody for being here. My first question, and I'd like everybody to take a shot at this one, but I want to start with Maria. The question is, how do you think having Joe Biden in the White House fundamentally changes the way these multilateral organizations work? And specifically, if you can, which organization do you think will see the biggest change in its strategy or tactics, at least in the way that it impacts Latin America? And what will stay the same? So Maria, with that simple question, let's start with you.
It is a pleasure to be on this panel. Thank you. And to be with Joaquim and Arturo and discussing these really important issues. I wanted to start by pointing out that Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor for Biden, in a panel in a presentation just last week at the USIP, the Institute of Peace, talked about the 4 pillars of this administration in all of the work that it does. And he started by saying that the first one is domestic renewal. The second one is building alliances. The third one is multilateralism, which is what we're talking about. And the fourth one is values, and values that have to do with our democratic principles. This is really, I think, very interesting, because in that discussion, he talked about how we go about building situations of strength, as he called them. And and he said this is going to take a great deal of work, and it applies to our region. He's not saying that you can pick up the phone and say we're back. It's not like Jefferson and Hamilton when he comes back and he says, what did I miss and what did I miss? This is 4 years of absence. But what we're seeing is that this administration is blending the domestic with the global. And they are looking particularly to key issues such as economic growth and environment, climate change, and strengthening democratic processes, and of course, COVID. These are going to be the focuses that we're going to have. And I think we're going to see that they're going to start with their own institutions to do this. I mean, it is not really a kind of accident that Samantha Power is heading up USAID and the Development Finance Corporation. These are going to be the first place where the Biden administration is going to bring in these issues, and they are going to play a role multilaterally. It's going to be very interesting as we start looking at the institutions like the World Bank and like the IDB, who it is that this administration puts in the U.S. Department of Treasury in order to be able to provide oversight to the multilateral organizations, because that position will have a very strong voice and a very strong input into the multilaterals in trying to bring about the agenda items that are so important for the Biden administration. So I think we're going to see a considerable move towards issues that have to do with renewable energy, with environment in particular, and very focused on COVID issues right now. And so, you know, let's look and see how that oversight is going to take place. If I have one more minute, the other piece that is interesting here, and where I do see maybe there will be some change, is if you would look at one of the major issues in our region, which is corruption, especially in the Northern Triangle. The multilaterals are going to have to decide how it is that they're going to put resources into these countries. Do you do it through governments only? The governments are corrupt. The presidents, in many cases, operate with absolute impunity. And so you begin to see that maybe working with the private sector, working with civil society, opening space for them would be one way to do this work. The IDB has IDB Invest to work with the private sector, and it has the Multilateral Investment Fund, the MIF, that can work directly with nonprofit organizations, with civil society writ large. So I think that is going to be a possible place where we could see some substantive change in the way that resources are put together. If we think about what will stay the same as you asked, I think the most important thing is going to be to just reestablish discipline, reestablish the norms, the way, the procedures that these organizations have used that allow it to operate. At the IDB, it's really a kind of poke in the eye that we now have a president from the United States in that organization, which really breaks the so-called gentleman's agreement that remained related to who is to be president of that institution. So and the current president of the IDB will see how that presidency evolves. So these are some of the areas that I think we need to think about.
Okay, thank you, Maria. So Arturo, I'd like to come to you. Again, the same question. Which organization specifically do you think might see the biggest change? What would the impact on that be in the region? And maybe you can help us sort of color in the other side of this, which is the reception that this strategy is likely to get from governments in the region like Mexico that have, again, kind of preferred the more nationalist environment of the last couple of years. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. And it's a great pleasure to be here with you and my dear friends, Maria and Joaquim. I've had the great opportunity of engaging with Joaquim and with Maria during my tenure as ambassador and her tenure at State Department. We conspired a lot together in a lot of these issues that we're discussing today, which Maria has just mentioned. Obviously, let's start with a self-evident truth, but not because it's self-evident, it's less important, which is that the world is not the same as when Joe Biden left the old executive building in 2016. And I think they understand that, and I think that both the president and his foreign policy and national security team fully understand how the international system has changed. I think they fully understand the huge challenge that has been triggered not only within multilateral organizations themselves, but in the appetite, the bandwidth of countries around the world to engage in multilateralism as a result of the pandemic and the socioeconomic effects that the pandemic is having on everything from the bandwidth of those governments to their appetite to engage in multilateral policies or multilateralism written at large. At the same time, geopolitics, like almost everything in life, abhors a vacuum. And the fact is, there's been a huge vacuum these past 4 years as a result of Trump's diplomatic vandalism. So the combination of that vacuum, the opportunities that exist for a Biden administration, the challenges of engaging with partners and allies around the world to address what I think will be the most salient issue going forward, which is how does the global community recover from the effects of the pandemic, and how does it address those gray rhinos, not black swans, the gray rhinos, the things that we know that are out there that we simply willfully ignored, like pandemics and climate change, and how you start creating what I think may be the tenor of the Biden administration going forward, which is not to go back to the meat and potatoes approach to multilateral organizations, but a more ad hoc, case-by-case, coalition of the willing building, if you like, with specific countries in specific fora for specific issues. That is, you're going to address multilateral organizations to address very specific concerns and try and build specific coalitions that may be different depending on the issue, and that Biden will try and do this to a certain degree. I think you'll also see an emphasis on what I call the new multilaterals. Yes, the UN is going to be important, and the fact that he has sent Linda Greenfield-Thomas to the UN is, I think, a very powerful message as to how he sees the UN in the architecture of U.S. diplomacy and international aid and collaboration. But I think it's these new multilateral bodies, the G20, the COPs, the Global Migration and Refugee Compacts, more than the UN or the OAS or the IDB or the World Bank, which will be important. I think Biden and his team will be looking at these new, much more, I think, nimble, maybe more effective to a certain degree, multilateral fora that have evolved over the past years, and that provide maybe a bit more of traction in getting things done than the traditional multilateral institutions. And then finally, to your question of how all of this may play out, and I think this may tee up our conversation and discussion going forward. How does all of this play out in inter-American relations? There's a huge paradox, Brian, which I think all of you on this panel immediately understand, which is, quite frankly, if you look at the history of who's occupied the Oval Office, I don't think there's any president of the United States that has arrived to the Resolute desk with the experience, the mileage, and the engagement with Latin America and the Caribbean than Joe Biden has. But at the same time, the region is completely disengaged either from relations with the United States, because the last 4 years they became personally driven, particularly Brazil and Mexico, that developed, I'd even say, a degree of empathy with Donald Trump. Two of the big diplomatic powerhouses in the region, Mexico and Brazil, seem to have either painted themselves into a corner or simply do not want to play ball. I've always said that Mexico is a country that has punched below its weight in the international arena. These days, it seems it doesn't want to even get into the ring. And you can see this in many ways, Brian, by what I think is very telling about the role that some of these multilateral institutions can play in the region, which is when Latin America had the opportunity to coalesce around a common candidate to head the IDB, right. They completely, they dropped the ball. They didn't care. In fact, I know that the US prodded Mexico to come up with a candidate for the IDB, and Mexico simply was not interested, or the only name that they did propose was unacceptable to the United States. And so there's a very interesting tension here between an administration that will seek to multilaterally engage the region and a region in which its own mechanisms for regional collaboration and cooperation are completely broken, in which the appetite of the region to play a role in multilateral policy, as we painfully saw during the IDB process, seems to be AWOL.
Arturo, I'm dying to ask you like 3 follow-up questions, and let's come back to them though, because I want to go to Joaquim. Joaquim, what are your thoughts in reaction to what Arturo and Maria have said? And again, this same question to you: what do you see in practical terms as the biggest change from this shift that we're talking about?
Hi, hello. It's good to be with you. I think that from my experience, I remember I was at the World Bank, of course, when there was a change from Obama to Trump. So I remember how much it changed at the time. And I think that the World Bank will be one of the places where you feel this change more intensively because of the leadership role of the bank on climate issues. So to the extent that climate is at the center of so many policies of Biden, this really raises the bar for the bank and the ability to influence in many parts of the world. There are also other more immediate issues related, for instance, to debt of poor countries, consequences of COVID. And these, of course, bring questions about how much capital does the bank have at this point to help countries, either World Bank per se or IDA, and of course, leadership from the United States. You'll be extremely important in both aspects. I should mention, I probably some of you have read the notes about the Amazon, that some old hands, big climate leaders from the U.S. wrote to President Biden last week, Bruce Babbitt and several others. There's a bunch of very good ideas there. And one of the most practical things, of course, is how to engage the multilaterals there. And I think there, maybe it's not a complete change, but it can really be strengthened, is the involvement with subnational governments and with other players, not only national governments. We know that because of, guarantees to the loans, you always have to have the national government involved in some ways. But if you just think about the Amazon, it's clear that in addition to this help with subnational governments, which very often have different views and are much more open to some of these topics. But there's also a big role, and it's written there in the letter, for instance, about how you help design payment systems for environmental services, how you can help the discussion about, for instance, Article 6 in Glasgow, especially everything that's related to carbon credits from the forest, from natural resources, how you can work with agriculture in this area, biofuels. I mean, there are a number of very specific things that the institutions can help. I believe that there will also be, of course, some changes in the IMF. Of course, if you have a U.S. administration with so much focus on full employment, on income distribution, so on, they will have, some impact on the surveillance work of the fund, and I hope also in terms of policies, in terms even of mechanisms, as you think about what kind of recovery we want. So I believe that the chance to channel, say, this priority through multilaterals is really there. I think, like Maria mentioned, it'll be very important to know who will be a treasurer helping this to happen. And being frank, I mean, I've been part of G20 work in different positions as a member, as a representative of the World Bank. I think that, of course, the G20 is great for big decisions, but then to make them happen, very often you do need the instruments of the multilaterals. So again, and these are very important tools, both for the ideas, the policies, as well as, of course, the finance. And having the U.S. really involved with that can really be very transformational. And you give also a big boost to the morale in some of these institutions.
Brian, can I very quickly do a two-finger to what Joaquim has just said?
Yes, although then I have a follow-up question for you and Maria. So you go first.
No, I just wanted to very quickly say that I think Joaquim is absolutely right, that one of the areas where there's a lot of promise, I think globally, but particularly in the region, precisely because of where federal national governments are at and the disarray of sort of inter-American regional collaboration and coordination mechanisms, is the role of mayors and cities. That is a place where I think the U.S. could really have a powerful impact in engaging on issues like climate change, like the successful integration of migrants and refugees, issues of democratic resilience. It's at the city level where the mayors are reinventing public policy that I think provides a huge space for U.S. engagement.
And the Amazon. Right. I mean, the Amazon in particular is one where I know that a lot of conversation is happening around, look, if the federal government, particularly in Brazil, doesn't want to engage on this, can we go to some of these state and local governments where they actually do have a lot of power and are more likely to engage on this issue? Go ahead, Joaquim. And then I want to go to Maria.
Okay, but also not only subnational, but through subnationals, you can also involve the private sector, both the local private sector as well as the international private sector, with a number of initiatives that you can explore later.
Yep.
Maria, let me go to you with something that Arturo raised, which is this idea of, make sure I express it correctly, or at least do my best, this idea almost of sort of a la carte groups of countries, or ad hoc maybe is the better term, where instead of going to like the big body, like the UN or even the OAS, you bring together sort of a smaller, more select group of countries to discuss a major issue. Do you think that's a viable approach? Are there any potential risks with that? And what issues do you think where that approach might be effective?
Well, to some extent, I think part of what Arturo's saying is that some of the more innovative ideas, the possibility of moving things forward in a faster way, will come from some of these groupings that have emerged really during the 4 years that Trump was president, or even that have existed before. And that can be, from my perspective, an additionality to working with the existing multilaterals. I mean, let's just admit that, the multilaterals that we have in place right now is, if you will, the infrastructure that we have created since World War II to be able to help us address a wide variety of issues globally. And while many of these multilaterals may be slow and may be cumbersome, may be political internally, may have flaws that don't allow us to get them do everything that we want them to as quickly as we do, that's what we have in place. And we have to be able to also work through them in a really significant way. I don't think that we can set them aside. I think we can help inside those multilaterals pressure for mechanisms that are going to be more responsive to the times that we have right now. For example, the idea of working with mayors and cities is an excellent idea. And that's something that the Obama administration was already doing when I was Undersecretary. But you can see how the World Bank or the IDB, could really be, if you will, pressured to take on some of these more, if you will, ad hoc initiatives. And so I think that that's a really important consideration that we have to put in place. I strongly feel that we can still work through these.
Arturo, I just want to give you a chance to respond, make sure I didn't misstate your point, and also maybe name another topic or two where you think that this approach might be effective.
No, and yeah, that's the idea. Given that the shape and the depth of the sub-regional or regional engagement mechanisms, collaboration mechanisms in the region are completely broken, that there isn't clear leadership in the region, that there doesn't seem to be a great appetite to engage in multilateral issues, given the size and the scope of the domestic internal challenges that most countries in the region are facing because of the economic and social effects of the pandemia. This approach, this a la carte, case by case, topical approach, engaging these countries to address this issue, engaging this other set of countries to engage this other issue, may provide great attraction to the way countries engage in the region. Clearly issues of corruption, of democratic resilience, of disinformation, of cybersecurity, of how this fantastic work, this yeoman's work that Colombia has been doing with Venezuelan refugees and internally displaced people. How can you build a success story of how countries like Colombia have out of their own both interest but also national interest but concern taken the lead when multilateral organizations have, to a certain extent, dropped the ball on issues like Venezuelan refugees and displacement. So I think there are a lot of issues that you can look at and try and build this sort of selective coalition building and engagement in the Americas.
Thanks, Arturo. I'd like to go to Joaquim with this next question. We have a lot of people who are participating in this conference today who work for large companies, financial institutions, and I want to talk specifically about the possible economic consequences of this, again, this renewed focus on multilateral organizations. I mean, look, Latin America is in the middle of its worst recession on record. Economies shrank about 8% in 2020, more than any other global region than the Eurozone, and we're only looking at a partial recovery in 2021. And there is demand from organizations like the IMF, like the World Bank, like the IDB to get money out the door. And in some cases, they've done so, as with Ecuador and Argentina. But, Joaquim, do you see any changes as a result, again, of sort of this new climate? Do you think that there's a chance that these organizations will provide more financial support in 2021 than they did in 2020?
Well, I think that so often the continent has a lot of contrasts. So for many countries, actually, we don't have a financial squeeze. Actually, commodity prices are doing well. Brazil, for instance, has a very strong capital account and a current account these days. On the other hand, direct investment has come down. So I think one of the questions is really this macro, this trade vision, and how the multilaterals will also help shape these questions, because they are very much linked also to say the development path, the development aspiration of some of these countries. So there will be the need for short-term help And I think in particular, the IMF has plenty of resources. The multilateral banks have a real balance sheet, so it's more restricted. But for instance, Brazil raised, I think, about $1 billion from the World Bank to finance these income transfers for the people in the informal sector last year. This, of course, is just a once-off operation, but shows that there is a readiness from the multilaterals to help when governments are interested. But I think more generally, the big impact is really about the new conversations in terms of development, what to expect in a time of ever faster change in technology, what it means. I mean, this is a discussion that, of course, existed before COVID, but it is even more urgent now, what it means industrialization, or what will be the path through services, technology for these countries, and really provide a livelihood to people both in the cities and then also in the countryside and in the forest. I think there would be the biggest contribution from the multilaterals. And I think that leadership from the United States can make a difference in this type of discussion that are much more complex than, say, a decade or two ago, but are totally urgent at this point when people were thinking, how are we going to rebuild your economy? How are we going to answer the social demands that in some ways feed some of these more populist, mood in some places?
So just to clarify, you don't see these organizations kind of turning on a fire hose of money as a result of the leadership change?
I don't. I mean, if you think about the World Bank, certainly you need a huge capital inflow and even a change of focus, because more and more the World Bank is not really looking at middle-income countries, more to other countries. So there will be also the need to rethink a little bit what are the priorities of some of the institutions. Now, for the short term, the real institution for that is the IMF. And Kristalina has been telling people that we have the money if Argentina needs or whoever needs, that will make sense for short-term, medium-term, 5 years, whatever loans to really help this recovery. What you're mentioning, that in some countries you're not going to the back of, say, the levels of 2019 anytime soon. Brazil actually is back in most of the sectors to the level of 2019, but there are a lot of uncertainty about the health situation and the impact on the economy in the next few months. And I think this is true for many countries in the region.
Thank you, Maria. And
can I jump in here quickly?
Yeah.
I was hoping you both would. Yes.
There's as I listen to Joaquim, there's one area which we haven't quite discussed head on, which is an important opportunity for U.S. engagement in the region, and which has a profound impact on the economic recovery of countries in the region, which is vaccination rollout and vaccination campaigns. And when you see countries like China and Russia scoring points in the region, whether it's through credit lines to acquire vaccines or making vaccines available to some of the countries in the region, this is one area where I think the Biden administration, obviously the priority of the Biden administration, as most countries in the world right now, is to do the heavy lifting domestically. But I think the Biden administration fully understands that there has to be equity and equality in vaccination, particularly with countries that have an important bearing on trade flows with the United States. And this is one area where I think the Biden administration, working hand in hand with particularly the World Bank, could play a role in ensuring that vaccination campaigns and vaccine rollout in countries in Latin America and the Caribbean is successful, because so much of the economic recovery and the and taking into account the potential social tensions that will be created as a result of the effects of the pandemic, have an important role in the economic recovery and resilience of all these countries in the Americas.
Maria, any thoughts from you? And one thing that we haven't talked about yet is kind of the specific question of the potential capital increase at IDB. But any other thoughts?
Just one comment that really flows from what Arturo said, which is that in our disengagement in the region over 4 years, which is a long time, the role of China and Russia needs to be mentioned as really key players in there, especially China, which has run as fast as it can to fill that gap that exists, and to be able to engage in trade, engage in technology, engage in a wide range of areas, which is what it does around the world. I mean, if you go to any African countries, you will see new highways built by China in Kinshasa and in other places. Well, in Latin America, this is a really important player that the countries themselves can also say, well, if you're going to put conditions on me as a multilateral, or you're going to create a difficult situation, I have somebody else that I can go to. So the Biden administration, in its relationship with China, which is complex enough and touches on so many other issues, is going to have to address this topic as part of the overall growth of the region.
Well, of course, the disadvantage that the United States has, or one of them, is that it can't just order its Fortune 100 companies to go invest, even when it's potentially at a loss, in the way that Beijing can. Maria, I want to stick with you, and I want to talk specifically about the role of the OAS, which we haven't really gotten into yet. It's a delicate moment for the OAS. Democracies all over the region are facing threats, including here in the United States, frankly. It's not just countries on the left, like the dictatorships of Venezuela and Nicaragua. It's happening in some other countries as well. What do you expect? What do you think we can expect from the OAS? What other organizations could kind of play a greater role in the defense of democracy going forward?
Well, again, remembering that Trump he took us out of the region for really 4 years of disengagement, but he took us out of the democracy world. He simply, I think the language that we've been used here demonstrates the way in which he not only took us out of the democracy world of discussion and engagement, but also diminished our position by insulting others and by operating himself like this diplomatic vandal that Arturo called. During that time, we have seen in Latin America the bout with its own nationalism and populism in Mexico and in Brazil in particular. So we are facing a difficult situation in the region in just trying to address this question of democracy and promoting it. Now, in the OAS, which clearly tries to operate and solve problems in Latin America in a collective way, it doesn't impose its position, whether it's in Cuba or Venezuela or any others, but it does try to reach a position of agreement. The Biden administration, I think, has a good opportunity to receive some support from countries in the region. There are some countries, I think Arturo may have overstated being Mexican, the populism and the nationalism, but there are countries that play by the rules. And there are countries like Colombia, like Peru, Chile, Uruguay, Panama, that can be an important initial block of countries that can work with the U.S. More actively. Remember that when Obama came into, Obama's administration started, the ALBA countries, headed by Chavez and tightly including important countries in the area, were, sort of ran the OAS and were able to really have it controlled with bringing in the Caribbean and others. But today, ALBA's totally diminished, and you begin to see in an opportunity for Biden to be able to form some larger coalitions within the OAS. Mexico and Brazil would take a lot of more work. I agree those countries are in a difficult situation. Almagro was just reelected, and Almagro really played his cards out in supporting the Democratic Charter and in La Carta Democrática. And, he has been fighting for that. I believe that having worked with Almagro, he's a man of principle, a man who supports and promotes democratic values and democratic principles. So for the U.S., I think the OAS presents one promising strategy to be able to re-engage and to support democracy wider in the region. But the U.S. also has to set forth some principles that it has to work with, which are, you have to treat all the countries with respect and with dignity. And you have to treat all the cases, regardless of which the country is, in the same way. And this is something that, as we know, Trump didn't do at all. And so I think we have to rebuild that whole part. So, but in addition to this, and just to answer the second part of your question, U.S. has been absent from the whole, if you will, structure of organizations that promote human rights and democracy around the world. And there are a number of these. And this goes back to the questions or to the topic that Arturo was raising and makes me think a little bit more about the importance of these. The UN Human Rights Council is a state member council that we have left. We have abandoned it. And our voice and the voice that we can bring together with others doesn't exist in this council, which is a really important place in which you can address democracy, not just in our region, but in others. But what's important about the Biden administration working with entities like the Human Rights Council is that there are Latin American countries in that council, and you can build support, you can work with them, you can build a block, you can create these situations of strength. And what Arturo said also in these, if you look at these areas, the Nordic countries, Finland, Sweden, and Norway are the ones that are funding all work related to building democracy and building human rights in the region. And so the U.S. could engage in an ad hoc manner, as Arturo was laying out, with these countries and really pull forward some of the issues that can be done. So the OAS is very important, but there are the international organizations, and there are many more that I can talk about, but let me stop there because there's that's enough talking from me.
Yeah, and we're also drowning in questions over here. But before we get to those, I want to give Arturo a chance to reply. But first, it's the same question for Joaquim. I wanted to send it to Joaquim first. What happens when big countries in the region just don't want to play? Right? They don't want to play ball with this new greater emphasis that we're talking about. And look, these are not hypothetical cases, right? In the case of Brazil, there is a foreign minister who is, on record on multiple occasions expressing his doubts about multilateral organizations, who has said on his Twitter account that he's worried that about, the Great Reset, this idea that the pandemic will be used as kind of a pretext to exert greater control and take away national sovereignty. I mean, what happens? Are we looking at a reality where countries are just going to sort of say, no, I don't want to be part of this process?
Well, I think that we have to consider that any country like Brazil, it's a diverse country, and democracy go with alternance and the ups and downs of the name you say it, and that's the beauty of the process. I think that, of course, a lot of people will be looking at the U.S. and see also how some alternance of views and policies will play out, and these, of course, will inspire and guide a lot of people. I think there are also many ways. You asked about OAS. I'm not a diplomacy specialist, but there are many ways where the underpinnings of democracy can really be worked together without people getting, involved in the domestic policy of neighbors, which, is a very sensitive issue in Latin America. But take, for instance, issues ranging from, privacy of data. Arturo mentioned cybersecurity. You could talk about fake news and some sort of framework to deal with these things. Even how you could use technology to improve land registry, which is a major problem in Brazil. So all of these things are things that are related to principles that I think are shared in the whole region of transparency, of a voice, of civil, relationship within a society. And I think that if there is a focus on these kind of things, will help tremendously the advancement of democracy in the region. So I believe that there are many, many ways that countries, especially large countries, can, get involved with multilateralism. You have the whole private sector who is being leading this dialogue, including the financial sector with many countries. So I think there are many venues.
Arturo, over to you.
Yeah, as Maria and Joaquim were talking, two very quick thoughts, both on sort of democracy and democracy promotion and engagement, and on multilateralist engagement in general. The first one on democracy, which is, I think the Biden administration and many in Washington understand that it'll be hard to reset what just happened in Washington on January 6th. That is, it will be much harder for the U.S., whether you want to sort of use the word preach or use the word engage on democracy, when we've just seen what has happened to democracy in this country over these past 4 years, and in particular the events of January 6th. And that will create some pushback, particularly from countries that feel either threatened or that cling to, Westphalian views of national sovereignty and non-intervention. The other issue is related to this, which is, I think, that many countries around the world, because of what has happened these last 4 years in U.S. democracy, and particularly what has happened as a result of January the 6th, and what you're seeing in the GOP in Washington and in the U.S. today, that there will be some countries that, as the Biden administration engages multilaterally and regionally, will be using a pipette to engage with the U.S., because some of these governments and some of these countries may be thinking, well, this may be a blip, because in 2024, there could be a reversal in the political fortunes of the United States, and that there will be some haggling in the amount of engagement that some countries will trigger with the United States as the Biden administration seeks to engage on a host of issues going forward. There will be, I think, some degree of political electoral calculus in the geopolitical engagement via multilateral organizations in the 3-4 years ahead.
I mean, this is my question and sort of my insecurities since we decided to do this panel a couple of weeks ago, is like, are we sort of are we acting like Pandora can be put back in that box, right? Like, are we falling victim to the instinct to sort of turn back the clock to 2016? And I know that everybody on this panel has said at one time or another that the Biden administration clearly knows that, it's not 2015, it's not 2016 anymore. But I guess the question is, like, philosophically, has something fundamentally changed over the last 4 years, whether it's because of, January 6th, which you mentioned, or just this long period of, I guess you could call it an emphasis on nationalism? I mean, are we deluding ourselves with these conversations about how these multilateral organizations are going to play a greater role going forward?
Well, if I may,
please.
I think, for starters, the fact that at the beginning, as I said, Jake Sullivan put number one priority in the pillars of priorities that the Biden administration will take on domestic renewal. They are talking primarily about how it is that you address this constitutional democracy and the fact that its own constitution is being threatened. So the concept of exceptionalism that was used often, but I think is one that really disappears in this case. The United States comes at this with a position of humility and with a position of knowing that in the process of building a democracy and strengthening it, it is currently internally facing its greatest threat. And so that in itself also, I think creates an opportunity for a more clear shared partnership with other countries. If you look at Europe, European countries are not aligned themselves in the way in which they look at this. So it is not just the United States. I think globally, this is an issue that we have to grapple with and we have to concern ourselves with. But I don't think that a Pandora has come out of the box. I just think globally we are in a situation in which we have to address these issues front and center. And so many of them are related to issues related to immigration and to climate change, and now obviously this pandemic. But overall, I seriously think that we can that we can continue to operate and expand the space in which these issues are talked about and are part of the agenda. And we should be the ones that are helping set the agenda around the values that we believe are the basic principles on which we're founded. And that's the challenge for the Biden administration. And it will have to fight hard. It's not going to be just here we are. Just one final quick anecdote. When I first became Undersecretary during the Obama administration after Bush, I remember going to a panel or a meeting with European countries on issues related to democracy and human rights. And one of them turned to me and said, "Welcome back. We're happy to have you at the table again." That's not going to happen now. The harm that Trump has done is so deep and so difficult that nobody's going to say to the U.S., "Welcome back. We're so happy you're back. Those 4 years were an aberration." So there's going to be a great deal of work, but we need to open the space to do this. And finally, Biden has called for a global summit to take place. And this is precisely the kind of thing that will be talked about at the global summit. And they also have to do a Latin American summit. The U.S. is responsible for one this year. So there are mechanisms whereby we can really make this front and center in the way in which we engage with the other countries.
Joaquim, did you have any thoughts?
Yes. First, I try to be optimistic. I'd say that some 8 scores ago, the U.S. also faced some challenges and overcame them. So let's not get too pessimistic. But I like something that Maria said, which is really partnership. Because not only because of what happened in the US, but also because the challenges for democracy are really new, and they're new for everybody. I mean, with artificial intelligence, with the new ways of, say, the labor market we move, there'll be plenty of new challenges. And I think that in this world, which is getting more and more multipolar, it'll be extremely valuable to have the U.S. as a partner, which has faced and won so many challenges, and really, I see a lot of issues to be addressed in a very different world. When I think about my children and so on, what democracy will mean for them, all the risks of manipulation of people and so on and so forth. These are very real things that are present in every country, and where there will be a need of joint work, of partnership, like Maria mentioned. And that's fantastic.
I want to apologize to our guests today. We didn't get a chance to get to all the questions. This was a wide-ranging discussion by design. I think we've covered a lot of ground and with just the best group possible. I would like to take advantage of the remaining 4 minutes that we have left and give each of our panelists kind of 60 seconds each, if you can do that in sort of television style, with any final thoughts or reflections on what we've said today. Maybe starting with Joaquim, since I see you now, maybe we can start with you.
Okay. I think that there's so much to be done together. And I take the words of President Biden. When we work together, so much more can be achieved. So I see, and the experience of the last 70, 80 years has been exactly that. Multilateralism allows us to do much more to so many more people. So I think there's a huge demand for that around the world, and especially in Latin America.
Maria, over to you.
Yes, I would say that I can't tell you how happy I am. You can imagine having Biden in the White House and people who I know who are so talented and committed to these issues. So I am very optimistic about the great amount of work that we need to do. I think we also need to remember in Latin America itself, and the Biden administration also has to put these at the core, is that there are, in not just Latin America, but around the world, humanitarian issues of refugees and displaced people that really need to be addressed. That number globally is enormous, and our system for addressing it is weak. And so we really need to strengthen that. And the other is that the issues that are really important in our region, particularly inequality, so and social justice in the way that we work, gender issues, these are part and parcel and should not be overlooked as we look at the primary priorities that we have right now. So I would just make sure that especially the issue of inequality fits in a really important way at the center of the way in which we interact with Latin American countries.
Arturo, those were two pretty optimistic messages. Are you going to send us away on a similar note?
No, I doubt it.
First of all, I would like to echo Maria. Obviously, it's a sigh of huge relief that Biden and his team of talented individuals are in Washington. In fact, I think we can understand how much we lost these 4 years when we're applauding a return to normalcy, things that were normal 4 years ago. I would also echo Maria that I think one of the areas where I think the Biden administration can send a very powerful message is breaking down the narrative of us versus them, and that the one way to do this is to throw aside this nativist, hateful, xenophobic immigration and refugee policy of the past 4 years, and the way that the U.S. behaves regarding refugees and migrants and immigrants in the United States, I think will send a very powerful message around the world. To your question, I'm a big believer in Gramsci's pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. I do celebrate that American democracy came out of this the way it did, but I cannot be blind to the tectonic challenges that democracy in this country, democracy across the Americas in particular, in other parts of the world, but we're talking about the Americas today, faces. At the same time, I think that there is an administration in Washington, and there are countries in the Americas that will be seeking to rebuild mechanisms of collaboration and cooperation, and that in the measure that we can deliver an early harvest of success stories on specific issues, whether it's environmental policies, whether it's immigration and refugees, whether it's democratic resilience and taking on disinformation, if we can start building that early roster of collaborative efforts between the US and specific countries in Latin America, then I think my pessimism of intellect will be tempered by the optimism of the will to get the things that we need to get done.
Perfect.
Wonderful.
Arturo, Maria, Joaquim, it's been such a privilege to have you today. Thank you. And thank you to all of you who joined us. And let's do this one. Let's do this one again sometime. This was a good one. Thank you so much.